Hi, so I'm Chris. I'm a researcher on the Gaming Horizons project. I was located in Leeds. I'm now at Sheffield Hallam University Institute of Education. I'm here to talk about mainly the scenarios that played a part of the project that dealt and related to what we're calling the cultural expansion of video games. The scenarios is one of the final deliverables from the project. I'm going to, in my short presentation, give a bit of an overview around the scenarios. I'm going to address what we mean by scenarios, what methodologically we meant by the idea of scenario when we set it up at the beginning of the project, and what the scenarios ended up being. I'm going to talk a little about the rationale for the approach, why we decided to produce scenarios and not another kind of written journal kind of academic output. I'm going to talk about where the scenarios came from in the project, what data we drew upon, and how they were shaped by what we did in the project. I'm going to address, not in too much detail, the kind of breadth, the coverage, the themes that we addressed in the scenarios, but I'm not going to go through every single one, just to give you an overview of what they talk about. And finally, I'm going to talk about the format of the scenarios, what they look like, how we're giving them over to the public, how we're conveying the information, and how we're using slightly non-traditional format to do this, using something that I'm calling a hybrid text. Okay, so first of all, scenarios, what and why? Well, first of all, I suppose it's important to say that the scenarios kind of tell a bit of a story. They involve a bit of a narrative. They're set up to give an example, to describe a problem or a situated story or tale that relates to people's engagement with video games in a particular context. We use them to explore a theme or an issue or an idea that came from our research around the use of video games in society and culture, and they therefore then lead towards suggesting a possibility for how we could be thinking differently, or the alternative ways in which we could be thinking about using video games in different contexts. Why did we use this approach rather than a more traditional deliverable written output? Two main reasons, really. We wanted to make sure that we were expanding the dialogue around video games and kind of expanding the people we were reaching, expanding the audience. The idea of these scenarios is that they're accessible to a different audience or different audiences. The way in which we're presenting them I'll talk about a bit later. We want to make sure they're reaching beyond the kind of academic audience in what we're kind of aiming for. So the number of different stakeholders that we addressed and that we spoke to and who we included during the project, we wanted a way of delivering our findings, our suggestions to those people, rather than simply just an academic audience, although I'll talk about why they are appropriate as an academic exercise as well. They let us therefore address an audience that was multiple and diverse, and also the kind of multiple aspect of the scenarios. We address a varied number of topics through a number of different scenarios, rather than kind of trying to reach a coherent, final, singular understanding of what we've been talking about. The scenarios let us address multiple themes and multiple issues. So the origins of the scenarios, where did our scenarios come from in the project? Well, they were informed by all of the things we did throughout the project, really. There's multiple strands fed into the scenarios. They came from originally the literature reviews. We've heard a bit today about where the literature reviews started from, where they ended up in our thinking. We identified a number of kind of gaps or possibilities within the literature that led us to do other things. And so the origin of the scenarios is really probably initially the literature reviews. The literature reviews fed into our interviews, so our interviews with multiple stakeholders, with game designers, with researchers, policymakers, educators, all the different stakeholders. Interviews, those stakeholders suggested a number of tensions and possibilities around the research in video games. That kind of led us to the workshops. The workshops we used to kind of expand the ideas from the interviews, and all of those different data points led us to thinking about the scenarios that let us draw on the specific examples, the resources, the themes, that all of those other data points had led us to. Okay, that led us to the themes, and each scenario addresses a theme in a slightly different way. That leads me to thinking about the scenario themes. We've got 18 different scenarios, so 18 different short narratives, descriptive narratives with possibilities and resources for thinking about the use of video games. Those themes include these things, but they're certainly not isolated to those issues. We've got the idea of motivation through gaming, gambling and dark design, representations of race and ethnicity, reframing ethics, funding and supporting games, and so on. The scenarios deal with a wide range of topics. There's just some example of the kind of breadth that we cover through those scenarios. I said I was going to talk a little bit about the format of the scenarios. I'm talking about those as a kind of hybrid text. First of all, we're presenting the scenarios online. I'll show you where to access those in a few moments. But basically that allows us to keep building on the scenarios. It allows them to be fluid and not static. So they're not fixed in a particular moment. There's a facility to add and react to the scenarios online. So it lets things change over time. We've included, as we can see some examples here, a combination of the written word and image. So we've got pictures as well as written text. That's allowed us to do a number of different things and think about the scenarios in a number of different ways and represent them in different ways. We've used in each scenario a series of avatars which have been drawn, and then we've got some kind of dialogue going on between characters where the characters are discussing some of the issues involved in each of the scenarios. That builds on a kind of emerging and growing tradition of using comics in academic work. Just a few things I can reference. There's a lot of work around medicine, graphic medicine. The work of Ian Williams and Muna Al-Jawad kind of fed into this, where they use a kind of talking heads approach to talking through medical research. There's work around graphic justice and law, and there's also other kind of social sciences work that draws on the image. There's Nick Sousanis, whose recent work involved him using or creating his dissertation using purely a graphic novel comic approach. There's the work of Katie Viggers, where she got artists to represent her work around funding in higher education. There's a work on everyday austerity by Hall and Bradley, and there's my own academic work, my own dissertation involved using comic strips to think through a group of children playing Minecraft in an after-school work. So there's all these kind of precedents for using comics and illustration in academic outputs. The idea is that the images work in partnership with the words to make different meanings around the ideas that we're representing. So the idea is that they're accessible but not simplifying the research and not simplifying the themes, but thinking of the image as an addition to the meanings that we're making around them and making them available to different audiences. Also, in terms of the format, I think there's something to say about comics being a kind of appropriate medium for representing the outputs of a project that was around video games. Some of the ideas that I kind of tackled through creating these images in collaboration with the other people on the project were around, for example, the ideas around representation. We were talking about representation in video games, and then we came to try and represent some of the kind of issues and people who were drawn into this project, and that led us to have to consider how are we actually going to represent some of the people for whom this project is aimed at and for whom have given us the information to actually do the project. So it also led us to think about issues of representation and the challenges of representing different stakeholders using images, which fed back into the ideas of representing people and their lives within video games. It let us represent the kind of diversity of the stakeholders involved. During the project, we spoke to a massive range of people from different places involved in different kind of roles. And so being able to represent that kind of scope through image was something that personally I kind of wanted to be able to do and bring into the project. So, in conclusion, I suppose the final thing to say really is take a look. The scenarios can and will be accessible from the Gaming Horizons website. So here we have the scenarios as they look on the website. You can see that each of the scenarios is kind of summarised on a main page, and if we choose one of those at random to enter after the summary, we've actually got more detail. We've started each with a bit of a quote from our data where we've drawn on something that a stakeholder said that leads us into obviously the keywords, but a description of the situation. We then introduce our imaginary stakeholders with their avatars, talk through a situation, and then we've got those stakeholders discussing either a problem or a solution that has come from the scenario. Okay, we have a summary in a nutshell, a kind of summary of the issue involved, and a box with resources at the bottom, things that kind of resonate with the scenario, are things that stakeholders reading this scenario and people who are influenced by this scenario might find useful to be able to pursue to take their understanding further. Okay, so that is the scenarios on, or my talk on the scenarios on the cultural expansion of video games. Thank you very much.